Meyer dedicates the largest section of his book to the longsword. Also known as a hand-and-a-half sword or bastard sword, the longsword was primarily a two-handed weapon. It was characterized by a long hilt, which was typically between 7 and 14 inches, attached to a blade of approximately 3 feet. Its earliest known use was around the mid-13th century. These early longswords had somewhat longer and broader blades that were designed primarily for cutting. They also had shorter hilts that were between 6 and 9 inches long. The development of plate armor in the 14th century drastically changed how swords were used. Thrusts that targeted gaps in an opponent's armor became the most popular mode of attack. As a result, swords made after the 14th century tended to have thinner blades. It is during this period in history that the longsword became the weapon of choice for medieval knights. It proved excellent for both cutting and thrusting. It was also light enough that mounted knights could wield the weapon with one hand. Additionally, an armored knight could move one or both of his hands onto the blade of the sword to make a very precise thrust or strike a powerful concussive blow. While its versatility and effectiveness made the longsword popular all across Europe, it was in Germany that the weapon was most celebrated. The longsword became the core of the German martial arts tradition. It was the first weapon that any German student was to master, and its principles were applied to combat with every other type of weapon. In his introduction to the longsword, Meyer writes, despite the high regard that Meyer and other Germans had for the weapon, the longsword was falling into disuse in the mid-16th century. By the time Meyer wrote The Art of Combat, it seems that the longsword was primarily a fencing weapon used in unarmored combat. This fencing variation of the longsword can be broken down into two parts, the blade and the hilt. The hilt is comprised of the pommel, the haft, and the crossguard. The blade is divided into 5 sections: the point, the foible, the mid part, the forte, and the shield. Meyer also distinguishes between the two edges of the sword. The long edge is the front of the sword and is in line with the swordsman's knuckles. The opposite, or reverse side, is the short edge. Similarly, Meyer divides the opponent into 2 main target areas, the body and the head, each of which is subdivided into high, low, left, and right quadrants. In Meyer's system, combat occurs in 3 distinct stages. First, there is what Meyer calls the onset. This is the initial cut that one swordsman makes, from a guard at his opponent. The second stage is called handwork. It consists of the cuts, parries, and devices used by both combatants following the initial stroke. Lastly, having failed to slay their opponent, either or both of the combatants will withdraw. These 3 stages repeat until combat is ended. There are 12 guards in Meyer's longsword system, 4 of which he names chief guards. These are ox guard, plow guard, high guard, and fool. Ox guard protects from cuts aimed at the head. It is executed with the hilt held beside and slightly above the head, and the blade angled slightly downward to point at the opponent's face. This can be executed with the sword on the right side of the head with the right foot back, or the left side of the head with the left foot back. Plow guard protects the body. It is executed with the hilt held low inside the forward knee with the blade directed towards the opponent's face. This guard can be executed with either the left or the right foot forward. High guard is not so much a guard as the initial position of the high cut. It is executed with the hilt held above the swordsman's head and the blade angled back at roughly 45 degrees. Fool guard represents the final position of the high cut. The sword is held out in front of the swordsman with the point directed at the ground. Both high and fool guards can be executed with either the left or the right foot forward. The 8 remaining secondary guards are as follows: long point, window, iron gate, crossed guard, side guard, wrath guard, change guard, middle guard, hanging point, key, and unicorn. Meyer lists 5 Mastercuts. The high cut, or vertical cut, is delivered by cutting downwards at your opponent's head with the long edge. The wrath cut is delivered by cutting downwards with the long edge, from either right to left or left to right. The cut should end with the hilt held by the swordsman's hip, so that the blade points downward and extends out at a 90-degree angle. This position is known as change guard. The thwart cut is delivered with the hands pointing upwards and the thumb on the underside of the shield. The hilt is held slightly above the head, and the blade angles downward to strike the opponent's head. It can be delivered with the short edge from the swordsman's right side with uncrossed hands, or with the long edge from the swordsman's left side with crossed hands. This is generally used as a countercut against a strike targeting the head. It is one of the most common cuts in Meyer's system. Similar to the thwart cut, the crooked cut is also executed by crossing or uncrossing one's hands. It is a countercut that can be aimed either at the opponent's sword to deflect an incoming strike, or at their hands. With the sword held out in front, the swordsman steps out to the right or the left, crossing or uncrossing his hands, in order to bring the sword around in a circle perpendicular to the line of encounter. This deflects the opponent's blade and leaves him open for attack. The squinter cut is a variation of the high cut, executed with the short edge. It is delivered at the opponent's head with the hilt held next to the swordsman's head, on the opposite side of the lead foot. After the initial cut is delivered in the onset, the handwork begins. This is a series of cuts and parries executed by both combatants, attempting to gain the upper hand. Meyer includes a large number of techniques and devices that can be used in the handwork. Some of the more useful and interesting of these are slicing, striking around, slinging, doubling, winding, and hanging. The swordsman in white attacks, and the swordsman in black binds against it. As black feels white pull away from the bind, he pursues to press the long edge of the forte against his arms. He then draws the blade back in a slicing motion. The swordsman in white cuts from the right. The swordsman in black parries, then steps out to the left and strikes around to the opposite side of white's head. Slinging can be used to strike an opponent who is out of range or retreating. If executed properly, a swordsman can generate enough whip to bend the blade around an opponent's guard, striking the head. Here, the swordsman in black pulls his sword back to the right. He then steps forward with his right foot and whips his sword around at the white swordsman's head. The swordsman in black aims a cut at the swordsman in white's left ear. White parries. On contact, black pushes the pommel under his right arm to direct a cut at white's opposite ear with the short edge. The swordsman in white delivers a high cut. The swordsman in black parries, then pushes the pommel under his right arm to strike with the short edge against white's left ear or neck. This is similar to doubling. The swordsman in white delivers a wrath cut at the head of the swordsman in black. Black steps out to the right and lifts the hilt of the sword over his head with his thumb on the shield, catching the cut on the flat of his blade. This is known as a hanging parry. From here, black winds in to direct a cut with the short edge against white's right ear. After a few exchanges, it will be necessary for either or both combatants to withdraw. It is important when withdrawing to cut as you do so to prevent your opponent from pressing you. Here, both combatants take 2 withdrawal steps, cutting with each. The following is a drill that simulates all 3 elements. The swordsman in white steps forward and delivers a high cut to the swordsman in black's head. This is the onset. The The swordsman in black steps out to the right and parries with a thwart cut at White's left ear using the long edge. Seeing the danger, White redirects his cut to parry Black's thwart. Black then steps out to the left, redirecting his thwart cut towards White's right ear using the short edge. White brings his sword across his body to parry Black's second thwart. Black unwinds and extends his hands to place the short edge of his forte against the short edge of White's mid part. Black then pulls back on White's sword, forcing it down and to the right. This is a technique called wrenching. Black executes a squinter cut at White's right ear. White parries Black's cut. Both combatants now withdraw. Each take 2 steps backwards, cutting with each step. Altogether, it looks like this.